Tonight, I am delighted to introduce the Honorary Fellow of Lucy Cavendish College, Baroness Helena Kennedy of the Shores. Baroness Kennedy is a leading barrister and an expert in human rights law, civil liberties, and constitutional issues. She is currently Director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and has received honours for her work on human rights from the governments of France and Italy. In Helena's practice of law as a barrister, she has acted in many of the most prominent cases of the past 30 years, including the Brighton bombing, the Michael Bettany espionage trial, and the bombing of the Israeli embassy. As a life peer, she also participates in the House of Lords on issues concerned with human rights, civil liberties, social justice, and culture, and is chair of Justice, which is the British arm of the International Commission of Jurists. During her career, Helena has been awarded more than 30 honorary doctorates and acted as principal of Mansfield College in Oxford from 2011 to 18. However, it is with Lucy that her Oxbridge connections began, and we're absolutely delighted that she's still such an active member of the Lucy community and has been since she became an honorary fellow in 2010. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Baroness Kennedy. Over to you, Helena.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be asked to take part in your lockdown series. And I suggested that I might talk about the way in which the rule of law has suffered in this period. And it shouldn't surprise us because of necessity, every nation has had to make decisions about putting limits on some of the freedoms that we take for granted. So even in places where like here in the United Kingdom, but around the world, governments have had to say there has to be some, prescription for the safety of the community as a whole, and it involves us having to put limits on the rights that we might take for granted in certainly most of our countries. And so, of course, freedom of association, freedom of assembly were limited. We were all asked to stay indoors, not to go out and put other people at risk. Certainly, if you were as old as I am, you were told to be particularly careful. And so we all agreed. I mean, basically, we all agreed. In the period before we entered into that period of lockdown, which was in March, I was taking part in the debates towards the end in the House of Lords because we wanted to put very clear curtailments on how you limit freedom, and what we made very clear was what the formula is. And the formula is as follows, which is that it should always be time limited, that it should be democratically decided, that there has to be sort of, if you like, sunset clauses or opportunities to come before Parliament and to say, we don't need these limits any longer. That we also, and we empower the police to, in whatever ways we consider appropriate, to give effect to, if you like, the community's desires to protect each other. But we also say that inhibitions and limits on our rights should be proportionate and subject to law. And so that is the prescription that we have used, and it's the one that certainly across the European Union or the countries which conform to the European Convention on Human Rights have applied, and we've encouraged other parts of the world. We as lawyers have encouraged the other parts of the world to do likewise. In some places, of course, it's not been quite like that, and I would strongly remind us all that we're also living through another period of contagion, and that is the rise of populism. We've seen a growth of populism around the world with leaders who are somewhat authoritarian. They often are able to claim the benefit of having been elected, but they've been elected on a politics of simple remedies for complex problems, and that's what populism is about. It's about saying, we can make things work by having a strong man in the lead who will take care of us all, and he'll lead his government to remedies of unemployment, economies that are not working successfully enough, problems around many different things. And then they're always put down to being problems that have been created by the other, whether it's immigrants, or whether it's homosexuals, or whether it's the Roma, or whether it's Muslims, or whoever are chosen to be the sources of the great problems that the country faces, and those authoritarian leaders prescribe ways of dealing with it. And one of the things that has happened, and I've seen this particularly because I'm sitting here in London, albeit, but in a global organization, which is the global voice of the legal profession. The International Bar Association is the umbrella organization for 180 bar associations around the world, slightly more than that, 187 now. And there are huge numbers of individual members and law firm members. There's probably something in the order of 100,000 members around the world of the organization, individual members. And so it's an organization that really is there to promote the rule of law and protect the rule of law, and to protect professional standards. Doesn't always work. There's often resistance in many places, and there are some things that there's some arguments over what the rule of law even means. And certainly if you go to some places, they will insist that the rule of law just means whatever is passed by Parliament, that Parliament or the governing body of the nation decides what the law is, and everyone's expected to comply with it. Well, that's not the rule of law, and it's really important. We don't discuss enough what the rule of law really means. And the rule of law, started its life. We like to proudly insist that it was Britain that invented it with Magna Carta. But in fact, the contributions to this idea of the rule of law have come from many different parts of the world. But the idea has been that nobody is above the law, that the law is basically going to be law which is there for all of us, and all of us are required to conform to it. That it should be transparent, that it should be possible always for us to know what is unlawful. We might not all have it written on, engraved on our hearts, but we should be able to access information about what is unlawful and what is lawful. There has to be an independent judiciary for the rule of law to work. And that means a judiciary which isn't appointed by the government, which isn't going to be obeying the command of government, or even do it simply because they know in their waters what's expected of them. The judiciary has to be independent. It has to be appointed in independent ways. It has to be separate from government. There has to be that separation of powers, and that element of having an independent judiciary is fundamental to it. And the other thing that is fundamental to the rule of law is that there is an independent legal profession, and that people have access to justice, and that it's not just there for those who are moneyed. So we can talk to the cows come home about what we think the rule of law means, but all of those aspects are facets of the rule of law. And I would argue that today, and I think I'm in good company, because Tom Bingham, God rest him, who was a great judge in this country, and who was the, if you like, the foremost judge when our Supreme Court was in the House of Lords, and was was a sort of committee, an appellate committee of the House of Lords, but it was actually a separate thing, and it was our highest court. Then it's now evolved into a Supreme Court, of which I greatly approve. But he was the senior judge, and he was a senior judge at an important time for us, because we introduced the European Convention on Human Rights into English and indeed into UK law, because it was incorporated in Scotland too under the Scotland Act. But we introduced the whole panoply of the European Convention of Human Rights into law in the UK. And we did it here in England and Wales with the Human Rights Act. But around the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has all the same sort of principles, and many nations have signed up to it. And the idea is that we respect the humanity of each individual. You don't even have to be a citizen to have those rights respected. And the rights are set out, and although we might not, know them all by rote, we have a strong sense of what they are. And one of those things is that we have to respect the individual humanity of each and every one of us. And it's put to the test, of course, when you have something like a pandemic. Are some lives being valued more than others? Does it give rise to blaming and a sense that some people are making it more possible for a nation to suffer the consequences of the pandemic? And it is very easy to enter into those tropes of blaming. And we've seen it with this pandemic. It was, very early on, some of those populist leaders who are authoritarian, and I would include in that Modi and Bolsonaro, and I'm afraid of President Trump, but many different leaders who have used this as an opportunity to basically seek to scapegoat and to blame certain peoples for the spread of the disease. And we've seen it with the blaming, for example, in Africa and a number of African countries. The homosexual community, LGBTI community is being blamed. We are seeing for example, in Hungary and Poland and parts of Eastern Europe, immigrant communities being blamed. We've seen it happening even in China now. There's been the blaming of a sort of second phase, a second spike being blamed on African students who returned once the borders were allowing people to go back to China, and African students went back and they claimed that they were the people who had reinfected everybody, and there has been discriminatory practices there. And of course we've seen discrimination here against Chinese people, and in the United States, with the way particularly in which the rhetoric of the president has particularly fingered the Chinese and in a very blaming way. And so we have seen this virus being used by people who've wanted to expand their power, and also wanted to, if you like, add to that vilification of certain sections of their communities, and usually minorities. And so I just wanted to take you through some of the things that we've been doing at the International Bar Association, because we very quickly realized that there were some horror stories taking place. It started here in Europe with Orban in Hungary, who already had been behaving really reprehensibly in relation to the judiciary in Hungary, limiting their powers, seeking to select them in ways in which basically the government, of which he has a significant majority, would be able to be selecting them, and to create almost like a parallel judiciary for certain areas of law. And we've seen him using law in ways that are particularly awful in relation to refugees, asylum seekers, people fleeing the Syrian conflict, and people who have arrived on his borders. And while no one's pretending that there aren't real challenges to nations made by the movements of people, and conflict causes those movements, but so has climate change. Many of those people arrive in dire circumstances, and we have international obligations which we should seek to respect. Our commitment to asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution, but a pulling up of the drawbridge has been what we've witnessed in Hungary and in other parts of Eastern Europe. Hungary and Poland particularly viciously attacking the independence of the judiciary, but also I've seen it in both places, with attacks being made on lawyers who would be deemed to be human rights lawyers, civil liberties lawyers, lawyers who are legal aid lawyers, lawyers who work in NGOs looking after the most disadvantaged. And in Hungary, for example, we've been seeing real attacks on the NGOs that look after asylum seekers, with a withdrawal of funds, taxing of charitable donations that are given, and excessive taxation because on anything that is offering assistance to migrants or to asylum seekers, those new tax rules. So it's being done in a very sort of smart way. It's done through the taxation system, and in fact, it's the taxation system that was used to drive out the European university that was set up used by Open Society using George Soros's money because he wanted to develop civil society in Eastern Europe and to provide opportunities for that kind of education, because that pedagogy just wasn't there because of the many years of communist rule. And so that university has been driven out of Budapest now and has relocated to Vienna because it couldn't survive, because the smart way of doing it was by attacking their funding system and the monies that they were receiving in order to from George Soros. And if you go to Budapest, one of the shocking things for me was going there and seeing last year how on going down main roads there were sort of posters hanging on the main streets which had cartoons of George Soros. I mean, cartoons that looked like those cartoons that existed during the Nazi era, depictions of Jews, and it's Soros who's the hate figure, and yet he's someone who's poured a lot of money into Eastern Europe in order to try to build and resource the organizations that support thriving civil societies. And you need active civil societies to keep, to hold government to account, to organize around things in our communities, and to feel empowered as citizens, and also to learn about what good citizenship looks like. And of course, Open Society has been roundly attacked in those parts of Eastern Europe. But what's interesting is that the similar thing can be seen in Turkey. And Turkey has also used this as an opportunity to, again, while the rest of the world is distracted dealing with its own problems, to continue to attack the intelligentsia, the intellectuals, the people who work in the universities, people who are basically believe in a sort of in genuine democracy, lawyers who are independent, or journalists who criticize government. They are all being rounded up, many of them imprisoned. And in fact, we've been involved in a number of cases, sending lawyers out on trial watches until, of course, the closing down of travel has meant that we can't see what's happening in courtrooms in many of these places. And so Turkey is another of those places where Open Society, an organization which is supported by George Soros's funding, which is to help support civil society, and the chairman of the board, who was a pro-democracy, the sort of person that would be admired in most countries as a decent person who takes part in public service, was the chair of the board, and he's currently in prison suffering. And when his case, and the reason that he's there is because Open Society had supported an organization that was involved in demonstrations against a park being turned into a military compound. And the park was the only place in the city of Istanbul where people could go. They would bring their children, they would play and so on, but it was also where they would go to demonstrate against things that the government was doing. And so by removing it as a public space in which people could gather, Geza Park, they thought they would prevent civil society giving expression to its concerns. And many of those, people like architects and people who are interested in the built environment, town planners and so on, had been part of those demonstrations. and they, with lawyers, with academics and so on, have been put on trial with the chairman and the director of Open Society. And the case in an interim stage was put before the European Court of Human Rights, which criticised the processes that were taking place. And so the case ended up having to be stopped against the accused. And as soon as Osman Kavala, who is the chairman of the board of Open Society, stepped out of the court to the cheers of a crowd, he was rearrested and put back in custody. So he didn't ever get to feel the embrace of his family, his children, his wife, because they immediately rearrested him on other different charges, all of which are those spurious things of conspiring against the government and conspiring against Erdogan. So opportunities have been taken during this period. These last 4 months have seen serious horrors, and India is another of those places where the Muslim community in India is suffering. Kashmir is really suffering under Modi, but the opportunity was taken to close down the internet in Kashmir. And then, of course, people had great difficulty in keeping abreast of information about what was happening with COVID-19, and also communication between each other and organizations. And many different people in the Muslim community across India have really suffered the consequences of arbitrary policing, detentions, beatings if they then they're accused of being outside of their homes. Many people are told to return to their villages without their wages, construction workers in some of the major cities, and having to make the long trek by foot with their families back to where they came from. Serious problems across India. The Philippines, you know, Duterte, another of these rascals, who's a serious authoritarian, who's been murdering, I mean, has been given permission to for the murder of many people without due process. If you want to clamp down on drugs and so on, then you know you have to go through the courtroom processes. We would argue, but no, they just bump them off, and but they don't just bump off people whom they suspect as being in some way involved with drugs. They're bumping off lawyers, they're bumping off journalists, and prosecuting anybody that is critical of government. And it's a similar thing. You see, Orban has just introduced laws where he didn't put a time limit in the first instance on the powers that he drew to himself, that he would determine when and how things were to be done. No democratic oversight. But he also introduced law which said that criticism by the press and the media of government's conduct of the pandemic had to be outlawed. And so new law was introduced, but drafted in a way and in a permanent form, which will make it very easy to clamp down and to inhibit media coverage of anything that the government does at all. So, and the same thing going on in the Philippines. And of course, one of the things that Duterte said was, a lockdown, you stay in your house, you can't come out, and if you do, you're liable to be shot. The police will be given instructions that people who are breaking the lockdown and come out. And of course, many of these areas are areas which are hugely overcrowded, where people are living in very, very intense circumstances, you know, where families are all hugga-mugga and very, very intensively populated. And people may have all kinds of reasons why sometimes they might have to come out, but no questions and no answers to be pursued. And you'll all know that what's been going on in Brazil with Bolsonaro and his denial, like Trump, that there's any problem and that this was some kind of some little flu, and people in their regions and in their cities having to make their own arrangements and encourage their own people to stay indoors and to wear masks and so on. And so the Bolsonaro thing, of course, had also impacted on other places in Latin America. And so we were brought into the knowledge of what was going on. For example, Nicaragua also followed the Bolsonaro route of saying this is all nonsense, and of course you can carry on having festivals and fiestas and so forth. And so the problems are huge, but they will not publish the proper numbers of those who are dying and those who are got the coronavirus. Similarly, in other places, terrible impact of this on places like Venezuela, where the problems of in the government level there, and the poverty of so many of the people and the suffering because of the economic crisis there, that the virus has spread like wildfire and is having terrible consequences. El Salvador too. And so I just wanted to say that, I mean, you know, we might complain here about you know, and listen to the arguments about do you wear a mask or don't you wear a mask, but by God, around the world, we're seeing really horrifying things. And I wanted to for a minute talk about China and Hong Kong. I've been very involved with the Hong Kong issue, with the pro-democracy movement for quite a long time, and a number of the lawyers who were there who were very engaged in drawing up the basic law at the time when Britain pulled out and there was a handover. Creating that new sort of, if you like, settlement was something that they were very involved in. Margaret Ng, Martin Lee, another Silk, Queen's Counsel there in Hong Kong, but others too. And I've maintained my contacts with them. And one of the horror things is that is what has happened over the last period. Now, of course, the protests last year preceded anything to do with the virus. However, there is no doubt that the Chinese authorities took their moment to introduce, I mean, the battle last year was about the extradition bill, because we'd already had problems where one of the British consul representative was in China and was taken to, in fact, imprisoned there, tortured there, and so on, and accused of espionage. And it was probably a kickback on concerns that there had been about Chinese espionage in the West. And so things were happening that were alerting us, and a lot of stuff was coming across my desk already about what was happening to the Uyghur in China. Also, the extent to which surveillance at high levels of really smart technology being used to invade the individual lives of citizens in China, and the ways in which that, you know, you could be a good citizen who gets plus points. So it's almost like, you know, with your bank account, you know, if you spend enough money, you get sort of special benefits and so on. That as a citizen, that you would get special benefits if you were seen to be, you know, filling a number of the criteria which were coming through on the surveillance activities of the state. And what's been happening with the Uyghur has involved very intensive surveillance, so that people who were they were obviously being listened to in their homes about whether they were speaking Mandarin or whether they were speaking their own Turkish language. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly, but I'm not Turkish as in Turkey, but Turkic. But if they were speaking their own ethnic language, if they were heard to pray, if they were overheard to be basically devout religiously, and in ways that were unacceptable to the state, they would be pulled in. And there are the incarceration of people in the camps has been going on now for a number of years. And the numbers, we still don't know exactly what they are, but they're certainly in excess of 1 million, but we think they may be as many as 2, if not, you know, we know that huge numbers of people are being arrested and being detained. And we also know, and you saw from some of the images that we were getting were coming from satellite footage, but now there's been drone footage showing people handcuffed and so on, a bit like Guantanamo Bay, you know, with shackled. And part of the permission, of course, that the Chinese feel that they have is that because we in the West didn't behave that well when it came to dealing with the business of terrorism, with Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, and I'm afraid our own detention here in the United Kingdom without trial, which had to be overturned by our courts. Thank God we have those kind of courts and independent judges, but it has given permission to autocrats and to totalitarians to actually claim that they're going after their own terrorists. And so these are people who are religious and devout, but the idea that they're plotting terrorism against the Chinese state is you know, well, just think about it. And so they're being brought in for re-education. The women, undoubtedly, and I saw the evidence before it was ever published, coming through about interfering with the reproductive freedoms of women, forcing sterilizations and so on. And we also know that women have been raped. We know that the abuse of the community is enormous. And while the Chinese are denying it, my answer to that is, why are you then not letting us in? Why aren't you letting a delegation of senior lawyers and judges come in and to see for ourselves what the situation is? If you have nothing to feel is shameful about your conduct towards the Uyghur, why not let there be a mission of inquiry go into the region and see for what is happening. What I would strongly say is that they have used in these recent months the opportunity to introduce the new security legislation because they thought that most people's heads were turned and that there wouldn't be as much concern expressed. Fortunately, that has not been the case. But the anxiety, if you look at the legislation, the anxiety is that it is really a power grab by the Chinese Politburo, where they're making it very clear that there is no independence of the judiciary in Hong Kong, that on any of those matters of national security, they're making it clear that the ultimate courts will be the Chinese courts, and in many circumstances people will be taken to China to be put on trial, and certainly that is where they would serve any punishment. So the idea of separate systems, that, you know, one nation, two systems, is a fiction that isn't being maintained any longer and can't be maintained any longer. So all I would say is that it's always the case that opportunities are taken when there are crises. You know, the business of international terrorism, and I don't pretend for 1 minute that we haven't been presented in our world with the problem of religious terrorism, which has had terrible, terrible effects on parts of the world. And the business of ISIS in the Middle East has been a shocker, and we've seen the genocide, in my view, of the Yazidi people, the attempt to eliminate them, the servitude and mass raping of the women, the beheading of the men and boys. It was a shameful, terrible thing, and all I can say is that you know, I've used the word genocide. What we have in our law internationally now is that a genocide can only be committed by a state, and ISIL is not recognized by any of us as a legitimate state. But there were people who could have perhaps intervened, nations that could have intervened and didn't. And it's one of the shameful things about the behavior, indeed, of, I would say, Syria and Iraq. But of course, the Yazidi were people who were despised in that whole region. And so it happened without intervention. So be very clear, when there are crises, they're used often by those who have other agendas, and they're used in despicable ways. And I think we've seen this with COVID. I want to, before I complete my little talk to you, I wanted to say that crossing my desk just now is just a horror story about what's happening to women. And it's not just here in Britain, where we've seen a whole, if we're talking about spikes, the spike in domestic violence has been really serious. But I can tell you, in other parts of the world, oh my God, the increase in homicides, the ways in which women are being abused is just so terrible. And of course, in places where there is extreme poverty, and where, you know, there is nowhere to flee to. I mean, that's the reality. And of course, you know, the agencies that might have been able to support aren't operative. There aren't the ways of helping that, at least in some way, was possible in the past. No policing of it. And the other thing is no access to, you know, to abortion when people are being forced into sexual acts and then impregnated. There's no way in which women can get the help they need. And even in the United States, a limit being put on abortion in places, an opportunity taken at this time to actually drive through some of the inhibitions on reproductive freedom. And so not a good time for women. And women locked back into their homes, suffering, but also the impact is going to be real in terms of what happens afterwards. And if we don't have our voices clearly heard, that this can't be used as a time to roll back the gains that women have made, then we're going to be it will be a serious shame on us. We've got to be very, very vigilant about the ways in which this could actually be hugely detrimental on women's rights and the lives that women want to lead, free of violence, but also you know, with real, genuine equality and equal pay, and all the things we felt we were moving towards, could be very, very hard to achieve in a period of deep recession, which we're likely to face, a period in which there will be a huge increase in unemployment, and where you know, women could very easily be the people who will suffer most. So those were the things I wanted to say as my remarks to you tonight, but I hope that we can now take part in a discussion, and I'm going to take a little look to see what some of you are saying in the chat area. Good. What do you think the EU could do to curb Poland's politically appointed judiciary, which has been announced recently? One of my great regrets has been that in the European Union, putting this deal together, this negotiated deal together, in which they would there would be a sort of, if you like, a financial support for nations to help them deal with the economic downturn after as a result of COVID-19. I think that they should have really been much firmer in saying that that there were, if you like, there was conditionality, and that some of the conditions had to be about conforming to the rule of law and the values that the European Union stands for. And so I was very depressed that you know, Orban and the president of Poland were celebrating their victory in having that conditionality kept out of the deal. But I just think that we have to be very strong on what's going on there. I was the result of the election in Poland was deeply depressing, because it could have been a moment for change, and I thought it might be. But unfortunately, the president is still in place, and he is one of the populists that I was talking about. All I would tell you is that the European judiciary, there's an association of judges in Europe, and they are very active on this whole business and are supporting the judges in Poland, who are being more vocal in some ways than the judges in Hungary are. But in both places, there are judges who are being very courageous and brave about what they see happening to their own constitution. The International Association of Judges is also taking up the whole issue of Poland and Hungary. And the reason why I feel that we have to not let this go is because if we see it happening in Poland, a place that we thought was, you know, really had embraced, if you like, the values of human rights and so on, when it first came out of the kind of Iron Curtain mentality. If we can't sort of re-establish things there, then it makes me feel pretty hopeless for the next period. So I think that we in the European, we should be combining with Europe in making our stance on this. It's one of the things I find so depressing about the fact that we've left the European Union. I was a Remainer. I know that we can't rehash all of the arguments and so on, except that I'm most anxious that we end up having a hard or no deal at the end of all of this, at the end of this year, because of playing, you know, whack-a-mole or whatever it is that Boris Johnson now calls it, that this business will hang on till the very last minute and we'll get the deal that we want. We won't. We'll get a bad deal. And part of being involved with Europe, with all the faults and so on, is that there was a purpose in it that was bigger than any one of us, which was about those values, which are about protecting the rule of law, protecting human rights, about sharing a sense of what democracy really means and how a judiciary should function. And of course, in Eastern Europe, many of those countries had for a long time not experienced that. Their judiciary were expected to do what their totalitarian governments told them. And unfortunately now, under the guise of illiberal democracy, they're actually behaving very much like they always did. So I feel that we have to be much more vocal, and I think that the whole idea of one country having a veto is not good enough in these things, and Europe should be speaking with one voice, and the UK should be joining in that voice. How far do you think we should be allowed to restrict the power of the judiciary? The judiciary's powers are already restricted because they're restricted by law. They are supposed to, deliver what is in law, and that's not to say that they don't reflect and deal with the context in which law is being delivered. I mean, let's go back to the early 90s. In the early 90s, I wrote a book about women in the law. One of the things I was very concerned about was that rape within marriage was still lawful. And eventually, our judges were persuaded, in our highest court, were persuaded that actually it was unacceptable in the late 20th century not to, that a woman was expected to deliver to her husband when he snapped his fingers or when he pulled down his trousers. And that even women who were not yet formally divorced couldn't say they were raped if their husband forced his way in and insisted on sex. And so, judges have to have discretion in order to deliver justice. That's the whole nature of it. And so when you say, how do we restrict the power of judges? Judges are restricted by law and by their the constitutional requirements of any nation. And so I wonder at the question, Mr. Butcher, but I'll no doubt you'll come back to me on it. Are you one of those people who thinks that Gina Miller had no right to bring her case? Power grabs can happen here. Scotland is in this position at the moment, in danger of losing our rights. When you say that, I mean, I always believe that the people of Scotland are going to have to be the people who decide in the end whether they want to be separate or not. I believe that we're all better together. In the same way that I thought we were better in Europe, I think we're better as a United Kingdom. And so I really am not a supporter of Scottish independence. But I have to say that if the Scots really do by some significant majority, and for me it has to be that sort of constitutional majorities, which is 2/3 sort of thing. If as many Scots as say that they want to be independent, then I think you have to respect that. And even if it means for us that we're losing, a part of what we consider to be our united nation, I'm afraid that that's what will happen. But I hope it doesn't happen. And when you say a power grab can happen here, who do you think is making the power grab? If it's a majority of a population, and I mean a serious majority, not 48-52, if it was a serious majority, I don't think that you can stand in the way of people wanting that. Membership of the US Supreme Court seems to be highly politicized. Is it truly independent? Well, it's because all the major political decisions and almost always end up in the Supreme Court. You know, should there, well, you can think of them. Should you carry guns? Should you have the right to abortion? All those kind of things, and they're very partisan things about which people feel hugely strongly. I always feel that many of those things are far better dealt with in Parliament, and I do think that the membership of the Supreme Court has become very divided, and the idea that we're now holding our breath, at least I am, holding my breath because I'm frightened that Ruth Bader Ginsburg might not survive long enough, and that it will give the opportunity to Donald Trump to put another person into the another sort of his own ilk into the Supreme Court is a very worrying thing. But it's interesting. Sometimes, you know, it's automatically assumed that people who are of one, you know, that a Republican appointee is going to be a terrible judge. And it's kind of quite interesting that recently Roberts, who was an appointment by George Bush, actually has gone, you know, has decided that the Dreamers, for example, should be entitled to stay in the, have opportunities to remain in the United States. Those who came as children with parents who came in illegally, but who've been brought up and lived in America and are American, you know, in their hearts, that they should be allowed to acquire citizenship. The decision that they wouldn't inhibit abortion rights. So there's been a whole set of things where he hasn't sort of shaped up in the way that people thought he would. But I would not like to see Donald Trump having an opportunity again. 200 judges on the federal courts across the United States have been appointed during his period in office, and that will they will be in situ for life. And that is going to have a hugely detrimental effect, in my view. I don't make any pretense of being anything other than a person who's committed to liberal values. I think that will be a hugely damaging thing to the court system in the United States, which is deeply punitive and which has incarcerated Black people in the most oppressive way. Now, what is your opinion on the recent protests in Khabarovsk, Russia, against Putin and the Russian government? Well, I mean, I have followed for a very long time events in Russia, and watched Putin, you know, consolidate his power and his position, and now we've seen him extend his period as president, you know, in the way that only authoritarians do, and he doesn't allow for genuine and real opposition, and we saw it with Khodorkovsky. You know, where he then imprisoned Khodorkovsky, and you can trump up charges on any wealthy opponent if you want to in places. And so and Khodorkovsky just spent 10 years in jail, and now is here living in the United Kingdom. And I meet with him, and we sent observers to his trial, and so I think it's interesting that there are these protests, but these protests have been going on amongst the young, particularly in Russia, all the time that I've been sort of following it. And so you know, what is my opinion on the recent protests? There are many people, and particularly amongst the young, who want a different kind of Russia, and who do yearn for freedom, and who do want a real democracy. But it's going to be, I'm afraid, a long time in coming. Barbara and King has asked about the abuses that women are suffering. and how they're even more at odds with the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And the question that she's raising is that the investment industry is focusing more on this. So do you think there is a need now for the professions to join forces to help force the impact of the goals for women? Is anything concrete already happening here? She's expressing concern about the merger of DFID into the FO and the loss of focus. Well, Barbara, I mean, I agree with you that I mean, you know, this is a moment when, I mean, particularly women, but it should be everybody, should be raising the position of women and our commitment to those goals and how you're going to go, you know, continue to achieve, you know, move in the direction of achieving them in a period of downturn and recession and global recession probably. And I think it is going to be very hard. And I am someone who shares your concerns about the merger of DFID into the FCO, because I think that it said it all when Boris Johnson said that, you know, why shouldn't we be more interested in combining the strategic trading implications of this with foreign policy, with development. And he said, why shouldn't we sort of be focusing more on Ukraine than Zambia? Well, all I can tell you is that, you know, you can chew and walk at the same time. And Ukraine certainly needs some work done. And in my area, on the rule of law, it certainly does. And on issues to do with women's rights, it does, because so many trafficked women come out of the Ukraine. But poor Zambia is in a bad place too. And certainly around the rule of law and around many of the issues that might concern us having this discussion tonight. So I am concerned that what we will see is a depletion of our commitment on development, and it will all be sort of directed towards winning favour in order to get trading deals. And by God, are we going to need trading deals? Because I mean, China might not be such a willing partner, and the trading deals that we might be offered by the United States, if Trump's back in office, are not ones that I feel enthusiastic about. And who else we're going to partner up with in the world, and with speed, I have no idea, especially if we're falling out so badly with our European neighbours. So God help us. Is the British government using COVID to pass some laws in a sneaky way while we are looking the other way? Well, I mean, there is no doubt that Parliament is not working in the way that it normally does. Certainly in the House of Lords, you know, business is overmanaged. The opportunity to really, you know, go head to head with government on some of the things is very, very difficult indeed, because it is just not possible in the hybrid system that has been developed, in my view. Also, so much is happening, which is about putting government power, and it's happening all without enough scrutiny, putting power into the hands of government using what are called Henry VIII powers, which is that they can do it by processes which don't get the same scrutiny as legislation. And so and lots of the things involving our leaving Europe are going to be dealt with in that way. And so I'm very concerned that not enough attention is being paid to this, because the whole of the sort of bandwidth of government and the media is being taken up with COVID, or with whatever Johnny Depp's doing to his former wife. Thank you. I'm a Scottish advocate, a barrister, and my post was about how far the current UK government might try to restrict the power of the judiciary. Well, I mean, we already know that there was a great deal of stamping of feet by the Johnson government in the run-up to the election, when you know, the Supreme Court under Brenda Hale made the decision that the prorogation of Parliament was unlawful. And I agreed with her decision. I think it was absolutely right. It was unanimous by the whole of the House of Lords. And I think the court was right. because I don't think that you close down parliamentary debate on something so important as our leaving the European Union. And I thought it was disgraceful that they were seeking to do that. I'm sure it was Dominic Cummings that thought it up. And again, I thought Gina Miller's original case that Parliament should be involved in decisions about leaving Europe because it affected our rights as citizens. That was right. It was our elected representatives who should be involved in it, not the executive, not the cabinet making decisions off on their own bat. And so I do think that there's going to be attacks on the judiciary. They've already said that they want to look at the role of the judiciary. They've already said that they want to limit judicial review, and I am concerned that their constitutional review is going to be one that is curtailing the things that I think make our democracy great. And I'm afraid what you have, I think that if we're talking about capture, and someone used that expression about a power grab, we've seen the Conservative Party, I think, being captured by its far right and by a section which is actually not really conservative, in that this idea that this Maoist, this idea that somehow you tear everything down and create something new, is so not conservative, but it's the Dominic Cummings way. And the attacks on the civil service should alarm us. The attacks on the judiciary should alarm us. The attacks on the court system should really alarm us. And the attempt to put Christopher Grayling into the job of running our security oversight when the guy was a disaster in every other area of government that he was involved in and cost us so much money, it would have paid us better to just give him money to stay at home. And we didn't do it. So, I mean, I'm afraid that I have a very poor view of what the prospectus is with the government going forward, because I think some of the things that have been so fundamental to our democracy are being unravelled.
And so, Helena, I think we're very quickly running out of time, unfortunately.
Okay, well, let me just see if there's anyone that I think I should pick up on before we close.
Of course.
Apart from your own work, what feminist texts would you recommend to a young aspiring lawyer in need of motivation and inspiration? Oh, there are lots of great things coming through. But I actually would say, please read The Secret Barrister, because it is a shaming indictment on what's been done to our court system because of impoverishing it, closing down courts, taking all that money out of it that Grayling took out of it, destruction of legal aid, and so on. And so it's not a feminist text, but I think he or she, we don't know whether it's a woman or a man, I think it is a text which is respectful of feminist values. And what else would I think that you should look at? Well, one of the people that I think writes great things is a wonderful, God, I'm forgetting all my names. You see, that's what happens when you get to my age. There are a number of wonderful women academics who are writing in this space. And so look for them, whole sets of them. But amongst the women that I love and respect are Keelan Gallagher, a woman who was the person who won the case, the Supreme Court case to give abortion rights to the women of Northern Ireland. And I think that's important. Whatever your position on abortion, you cannot have people in some part of the United Kingdom not having those rights. And I felt that it was a really important case, and she was the person who really won it through. And who else is writing great stuff? Nicola Lacy, that's the person that I wanted to mention. Look her up. She's a great feminist writer, academic, and any of her essays, any of her things in law journals are worth reading. So terrific stuff. I think that's it.
Yes, so Helena, it just leaves me to say thank you so much for virtually returning to Lucy to give us your time this evening. And
well, I'm sorry. It felt like a kind of one-way traffic because I couldn't see you all, and I couldn't. I always love the business of having the real exchange, and you know, getting to have the different voices, and I'm sorry that our world at the moment isn't allowing for that in quite the same way. But I will come back and visit Lucy when we're all visiting again, because it's a wonderful place, and I feel proud of my association with it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. We love to hear that, and we'd love to have you back when things are more normal.
Good.
Thank you as well to everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the talk as much as I have. And also just to remind you that it will be available on YouTube in the next coming days. We'd love to see you again next week. As mentioned, next Wednesday, we will be having a talk about the recent pandemic. So please do join us for that. And it just leaves me to wish you all a very good rest of your day or evening, whatever you're doing. So thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Great.